Good morning, Stampers. It's Pat Fairless with Fairless Stamp and Flair. Welcome to Connect to Create. If you are unfamiliar with what Connect to Create is, it is a collaboration between myself and Kathy Ondas from Simply Cards by Kathy. And each week we come to bring you a new technique, or maybe it's an old favorite that's being revisited. And today I'm going to be sharing with you a technique called Watercolor Emboss Resist. It's a fairly simple technique. It's a little messy, so I have some extra paper towels and microfiber cloths handy. And hopefully I won't make too big of a mess of myself or my workspace. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to turn my camera down to my desktop. Okay. The stamp set, there's actually two methods, or there's probably multiple methods of watercolor embossed resist. I'm going to show you two of them today. The first one will use water painters, and the second one I'm just going to use my re-inkers. So the first card, I'm going to do the first method first with the water painters because it's a little less messy. So if I make a mess of my workspace, I won't have to deal with it through the second technique. But so I'm going to call this one method one, and I'm going to use this stamp set called Butterfly Brilliance. It's from the current annual catalog. It's basically a large background stamp that there is a coordinating die that would cut out all 6 butterflies at the same time, but we're just going to use it as the stamp. And I like to use, for this technique, I like to use my stamp apparatus, and the reason is I want to make sure that I get a good ink coverage or embossing coverage on my watercolor paper. And when you have watercolor paper, there's always some texture. So you run the risk of not getting a great image on a single stamp. So we're going to use our embossing buddy first and I have this all set up. Maybe I should explain why this isn't up in the corner of my stamp apparatus, because normally we stick it in the corner, and that way we can make sure things are aligned. But because this stamp is larger than the piece of paper I'm using, or the watercolor paper, it needs to hang over the edge. And if I had my paper all the way up in the corner, I wouldn't be able to get the stamp up in there. So that's why I have it offset. So I'm just going to tap my embossing buddy on my watercolor paper to make sure I get rid of any static. And that's always the first thing. If you don't have one of these embossing buddies, these are a great little tool, and you might want to consider getting one. Stampin' Up! Has reintroduced them with the current mini catalog, and they come in a kit with the embossing buddy, a tray, embossing tray, a pair of tweezers, and a brush. And it's a great little kit, but it's a good thing to get into a habit of always rubbing the embossing buddy over your cardstock before you emboss. And I'm going to use Versamark ink, of course. I have inked this up with my re-inker, so it's pretty juicy, but just to be sure, we're using the stamp apparatus so that we can stamp multiple times and make sure I get everything well covered. Plus, it's a big stamp, so it helps with that as well. I think my magnet moved just a hair here. Wants to interfere with my stamp a little bit. Pull him back. Okay. So then I just take my fist and rub it all over the large stamp to make sure everything, all the ink is transferred as much as possible. Sometimes it helps to just give it an extra second or two on the paper to help that transfer. And then I'm going to repeat that process. And I'm going to do this 3 times today just to make sure I have good coverage. So this is time number 2. I'm still worried about this magnet. There we go. Felt like it was interfering with the stamp. I don't think it really was, but when you have these large stamps like this, it's really hard to find room for your magnet on your cardstock unless you were to make your cardstock much larger than it needs to be. Now, one thing I do typically do is I will make a larger Technique sheet than I plan for my card, because that way I have areas I can trim off and use the scraps to decorate my inside of my card or maybe my envelope. Some techniques won't let you do that, or it doesn't work to do that because you can't trim the edges after you complete the technique. But with this one, you can. So I have cut my piece of watercolor paper here to 5.5 by 4.25, which is the full size of a card front. And I will be trimming it down when I show you the card that I used with the stamp. I do trim it down. So, all right. Let me take my chamois. That's 3 times. We're going to call that good. Just wipe this off a bit. Knowing me, I tend to lay things where they don't belong, and I don't want to get Versamark on something I don't want it on. So we are finished with that. So I'll set it aside. We will use the Stamparatus again for the next card. Get this out of our way. And I don't know that you can see this. You can see, I guess you can see the Versamark a little bit, but we are now going to emboss this with white embossing powder. And let me just move my Versamark out of the way of the embossing powder. Don't want Versamark in your embossing powder, or embossing powder in your Versamark pad. That just doesn't work well. And I've learned that from experience. So I'm going to cover this well with white embossing powder. And we'll kind of shake it around a little bit like we would if we were flouring a baking pan, just to make sure it's well covered. Tap it off. And I kind of check it to make sure I don't have any stray. Got a piece of fuzz right there. Probably best to let it go. If you have a little stray embossing powder where you don't want it, you can just take a little brush and kind of brush it off. Any little painter's brush works well for that. I got a little bit out here on this edge I can see before I emboss it. So I always have a little brush handy when I'm embossing to get rid of any errant strays. So now I'm going to bring in my heat tool, and we are going to emboss this. And you're probably wondering, what am I doing with a little cake pan here? I use this a lot of times for embossing. It's an old cake pan that is, I don't know, doesn't look so good. I wouldn't bake anything in it anymore. I'd be afraid what stuff is getting into my cake, but it works great for embossing. And I put a piece of felt on the bottom, so if I'm on a surface where I have to worry about heat, then there's no worries. But I like it because it's metal and it does provide heat from the bottom to help with the embossing. Plus, you know how sometimes you emboss and the embossing powder wants to blow around a little bit off from your cardstock? Well, this helps keep it contained within the tray, which is nice. So, but sorry for the noise. I chatted a bit with the thing down by my leg to hope it has heated up. But I'm going to need to heat this whole thing. And with embossing, I love embossing, heat embossing. You have to watch carefully for the embossing powder to turn shiny. And as soon as it turns shiny, you want to move on, because you don't want to overheat. Because once you overheat it, it loses its shine, and then you can't get it back. So you just kind of need to keep your eye on it. And once it turns shiny, go to the next spot until that spot turns shiny. So I'm going to finish this up. I hope this video turns out all right. I've been having my share of various technical difficulties this week. I think there's something in the atmosphere that doesn't like me, in the electrons out there, wherever this stuff works. So I'm hoping this goes okay today. I'm hoping you can see me, or see the desktop, not me. I do have my camera set a little further away than normal because I wanted to make sure I could get my entire Stamparatus into the frame. So it looks about done. It's always good to pick it up, get it under some good light, tip it around and make sure it appears shiny everywhere. So make sure you got it fully cooked. And that looks pretty good. So let me move my cake tin out of the way. And I am going to put down a piece of, like I said, this is a little messy, so I'm going to put down a piece of paper towel to keep some of the mess off from my paper here. And let's get our ink colors. So I am going to use 5 different colors for this next step. I've got Gorgeous Grape, Flirty Flamingo, Coastal Cabana, Granny Apple Green, and Daffodil Delight. And let me put them in the direction I used them in the order I used them in. And the easiest way I found when you want to watercolor with, you can either use your re-inker and add some in the lid, so a re-inker in the lid, or you can pick some ink up with an acrylic block. And for the technique today, I'm just going to use and pick a little ink up with my acrylic block of each color. And then I'm going to set my pad aside because once again, knowing me, I will have something laying somewhere on an ink pad that I really don't want laying on an ink pad. So this helps. Now I could still lay it on this block, I guess, but let's hope for the best. A little Daffodil Delight here. And Granny Apple Green. These acrylic blocks are useful for a lot of things, aren't they? I think my Granny Apple Green could use a little re-inker. But these acrylic blocks work well as a little paint palette just to pick up some ink when you want to watercolor. You can just use your water painter then and pick it up off the block. It also gives you a surface where you can maybe manage the color a little bit better because you can add some water to your block and lighten it up if you want to lighten it up. Today, I'm pretty much going to use full strength. I may lighten the Gorgeous Grape a little bit. But all right, so we have this now embossed with white embossing powder on watercolor cardstock. Now I'm going to take my large water painter. I have a little glass of water sitting here just next to me. There's water in this and I can squeeze it. Sometimes it's just as easy to pick some up from the glass, but I can squeeze this. You can see that drops will start to come down through here. And you just want to wet this entire surface. You don't want it so wet that you have puddles, but you want it wet enough so that the ink flows fairly well. Once you start putting the colors onto this. So we're going to cover this whole thing with water. Got a piece of fuzz there. I swear my house is full of cat hair and I don't even own a cat, but my neighbor's cat came for a visit yesterday and I think she's really shedding because spring is coming, right? So seems like I have more fuzz than normal around. Maybe I'm shedding too. I don't know. Okay, let me kind of move this to see if I can make sure I have some water covering the surface. And it looks like it's pretty good. So I'll put that away. I'm going to move. And hopefully I won't knock that water over. All right, so now I'm just going to start with my first color. And this one, like I said, I am going to water it down just a bit with a drop. Just squeeze my water painter. You can always darken, but it's really hard to lighten once you add color. And sometimes once it's dry, then when it dries, it also tends to dry lighter. So now we're going to use the Flirty Flamingo, and I'll just brush some of that on here. I'm just brushing this as on a diagonal. You can make any pattern you want. You can do random colors here and there. You could do horizontal lines. I'm just doing diagonal lines because that's what I felt like doing. But you can do anything you want. There's no rules, which is what's nice about this technique. No rules. Do what you like, right? There's recommendations, not rules. But for this part of it, no rules. And we may want to come back and add a little more yellow afterwards. Yellow is obviously quite light, but you can start to see on the embossing powder or on the embossed areas, you can see the liquid just puddles up. It doesn't absorb, and the color goes into the pattern behind. On the darker colors, you can now really start to see your butterflies. On the yellow, not as much because it's a lighter color. So now we'll add a little granny apple green. I usually overlap the colors just a tad. But again, you can leave white spots. You can do whatever you want to do with this technique. That's what's fun. It lets you play, and there's no right and no wrong. One of the recommendations is always clean your brush between colors. You don't want your colors to get muddy. And you do have to watch that as you blend them where they meet as well. Some colors blend together really well. Obviously, if you blend blue and yellow, you'll end up with green. But some colors that you blend, you just tend to end up with what looks muddy. So just pay attention to what you're blending together. And okay, so I could call that good. Like I said, I am going to come back and just add a little more. Now I picked up some green there, you see, which is fine. I just want this to be a little deeper yellow so that the butterflies pop a little bit more. That's the only reason I'm doing it. If I had used a different color embossing, the next method I'm going to show you one done with silver embossing powder, but had I used a colored embossing powder here, then you could make these all very pale and it would show. But I'm just going to make the yellow a little bit darker. Okay, and I think I'm going to add a little bit more Coastal Cabana down here. All right, I like that. Let me pick it up and show you. Can you see that? It's pretty colors, right? So let me bring in the card that I made with that. Set this somewhere. And here's the card. Kept it very simple. I just added a tag. The tag and the little butterflies are from the designer tag dies. The little greenery behind is from that same die set. The thank you is from Charming Sentiments with the coordinating dies that go with that. So, and then the inside, it's a thank you. So I rarely put a stamp on the inside. You obviously could, but I leave a note. I leave room for a note. And here's what I meant by I trimmed it and I have a little scrap left over. So I just added that to the bottom of my inside. And when I trimmed it, I also had a few more littler scraps left over that I stuck on my envelope, so that we've got inside and envelope decorated with scraps. So that's my first card. So let me clean up my mess here a bit. I'm going to wipe these off a bit just to be on the safe side. We'll clean them better later. but I'll get the worst of it off and out of my hair. Set this aside. Get this inky thing out of the way. You can see I've been playing with this technique for since the weekend, and yeah, it's a little messy. I have ink on my fingers, but which stamper doesn't have inky fingers, right? If you're a stamper, you have inky fingers. Okay, so my second card, I'm going to use a little bit different technique. It's the same technique, Watercolor Emboss Resist, but it's a little bit different way of doing it. And it's even messier. I do not need my magnets for this one, so let me get those out of my way. And I am using this background stamp called hand-drawn dots. So the first steps are exactly the same. So I am going to stick, in this case, because this covers my complete cardstock, I cannot use my magnets, so I am going to put some temporary adhesive. Find the smooth side, rougher side. They're both rough, but one's rougher than the other, so I tend to use the smoother side. So this is temporary repositional adhesive, so it holds it a bit better than if it had nothing on it. And now the steps are exactly the same. So I'm going to hit it with my embossing buddy first. Something to see, I almost forgot. Okay, and then we will ink this up. And do the same process. This down. I tend to put my stamp case over here under the side that I'm inking because it helps support the plate, and it seems to be the exact thickness that works well. So pick this up and hope my card didn't come up. And we will repeat just like we did for the first one. The difference comes in the final step. I probably could have saved some time and had this pre-embossed. Now I think of that. Didn't think about that before. This can't be much fun watching me do this. You can fast forward. All right, one more time. All right. Give it a minute. Let's set this out of my way. And pick this up. All right. Check this out. Yeah, it looks like I got most areas covered. I see a blank spot, but it's going to be what it's going to be. We'll cover that spot up with something. So with this technique, I recommend adhering or attaching somehow your watercolor paper to something stiff. I like to use this little plastic clipboard that I have because I want to actually adhere it to this. Now, I've tried it with repositionable. It doesn't work great on this. It doesn't hold it very well. So instead, I am just going to use my Stampin' Seal. And I will put some of that right on here. Looks weird, I know. But it holds it. Okay, and the reason we want to hold it is we're going to dump a little bit. This is going to get wetter. And it's nice to have it dry. In fact, I think I would like to have some of this. I should have done this before or after I embossed. Oh, that's what I did wrong. All right. Got ahead of myself. I didn't emboss it yet. So let's hope this works, because I turned it upside down with that embossing powder on there. That is probably not going to be great, but a lot of this one is getting covered up, so we'll see what happens. Yeah, I see the spot I missed. Right up here. But you get the idea, right? For some reason, my Versamark didn't get up on that spot. But that's all right. You'll get the idea of how to do it. It'll work fine. So now I have to bring my heat tool back. Lots of stuff laying around today. It's confusing. I got so many bits and pieces around. So. And again, I could clean up some of these areas before I embossed. Normally I would, but for the sake of the technique, and it's not going to hurt anything, and for the sake of time, we'll work with what we have today. These are large surfaces to emboss, so it takes a bit of time. Metallic embossing is so much easier to see when it turns, because you can just, the color changes, and white's a little more, white or clear are definitely easier to, or more difficult to see. But once again, you don't want to overheat it, because it does lose its shine. And we don't want to lose our shine, because that's the whole point of embossing, right? Okay. Now let me pick this up and see if I've got it all cooked okay. I got one little spot down here that just might not be fully cooked. There we go. All right. Well, this was not the greatest stamping job, but that's okay. The technique will still be able, we'll still be able to demonstrate the technique. Oh, embossing powder. Okay. So now I'm going to adhere this to my little clipboard here, because this one uses a lot more liquid. By adhering it to a nice flat surface, you can let it dry on this surface, and then it'll dry flatter. You don't have to worry as much about it curling. And in addition, because we're just going to drop ink on here, we can then move this around if we want to let it run, which makes kind of a pretty effect if it runs sometimes too. So again, next step is to make our surface fully wet. So I'm using my wide water painter again. If you don't have water painters, just use any kind of artist brush along with a little glass of water and add water. This one, with this particular technique, method 2, you want it to be a little bit wetter than we had it for method 1. You still don't necessarily want it to be puddling, but you definitely want it to be a little bit more wet, because once you drop the ink, then that helps it to really spread. And if you have trouble with it spreading, it means it's not wet enough. But there's an easy solution to that. You can always add a little water with your Stampin' Spritzer. So I got that handy just in case I need it. And I have 4 colors of ink today. I have Balmy Blue, Tahitian Tide, Pacific Point, and Night of Navy. Now for my card, I'm going to show you, I use Night of Navy, Pacific Point, and Balmy Blue. Today I'm going to try the Night of Navy. Was pretty dark. I do like how it turned out because, again, they lighten as they dry. But I'm going to use the Pacific Point, Balmy Blue, and Tahitian Tide. So we'll see how that turns out. I'm just rubbing it again with water. I am going to keep my water painter somewhat handy for this one because you do want it to be wet. And as I was chatting, it gives the water a chance to absorb and dry out. So I'm going to start with Pacific Point. And for this technique or method, I guess better word, we are just going to drop some ink here and there and see how that spreads. Can you see that? Let me try to do it. Isn't that cool how that runs? It looks like Starburst or something, doesn't it? Now, if you want it to run more, like I said, you can pick it up and let the ink run. But I'm going to add the other colors. So let's add Tahitian Tide next. Down here in the corner. Maybe another one up here. It's going to already mixing with the two. And you can see to some extent it is not as wet. So that's it stays in that smaller puddle. So that's, if we have that situation, that's where I have my stamp and spritzer and just aim it at the spot and see how it spreads. And let's add a little Balmy Blue. Now these colors are all close in tone. But again, a little bit of color variation just adds to the depth. Now down here where it's not spreading, we can spritz again. And if you spritz in the direction that you want the ink to go, it kind of pushes it in that direction. If you go straight down, it just causes it to spread, right? But this is where, I mean, you get a lot of water. And so this cardstock, it becomes, your watercolor paper becomes very wet. So you need lots of paper towels handy to kind of absorb a little bit. Now you can just let this dry naturally. If you choose to use a heat tool to expedite the drying process, I recommend that you somehow carefully pick it up and try to do it from the back, or just be very careful because, again, if you overheat the embossing powder, it's going to lose its shine even the second time around. So you can also use this paper towel if you've got a spot that just feels like it's got too much. And if you, I don't necessarily, it's not my favorite thing to do, but you can pick up a little color. The thing that I don't like is I can see the pattern from the paper towel because it's got texture on the paper towel. So if that happens, I usually just take my spritzer, which makes it wet again, but it got rid of some of the ink. And that just smooths it out. So my preference in this case with this particular method is I just wipe up the excess here around the edges. And because it's adhered to this little clipboard, it'll stay flat. And I set it aside to dry. So that's what I'm going to do. And I will bring in the card. I think before I do that, I am going to grab a baby wipe. Had those handy for my hands. Oh, one hint. I don't know if you can see this or not, that paper towel, but you do want to cover your surface for this method too, because you can see when you spritz that ink afterwards, you can see on my paper, I've got a lot of ink here and I've got some over on my my table as well. So you do have to be a little careful with the spritzing, and just make sure you don't want to have anything too close that you don't want to get ink on it. All right. So here, let's show the card. Again, as a reminder, here was the completed technique. I'll tip it a little bit. Still running because it's wet. But you can see the silver on there, I hope. And this is the card I made. So this was made with the Night of Navy, Pacific Point, and Balmy Blue. And they're not a lot different. This is just a little bit darker, but I liked how it turned out. I added the little Easter Bunny from the Easter Bunny stamp set. All the stamps here are in that set, the little flowers, the butterfly, the sentiment. Added a little piece of metallic mesh ribbon for a bow to decorate them. And then I had a leftover piece here for a strip to decorate the inside. That's why I make it bigger. When I cut a strip off, then I can use a piece here. And this stamp here on the inside is from a very, very old stamp set. I think it was one of the first ones I purchased after I became a demonstrator, because I joined in February, and so Easter things were in the catalog, right? And I loved it then, and 16 years later, I still love that stamp set, and it's one I'll probably keep forever. He is not here, but is risen. And that's the whole real meaning of Easter, right? So I love that stamp set. I put it on the envelope too, to decorate the envelope. So, okay, that are the two methods I wanted to show you. Let me flip my camera back. All right. So I hope you liked Watercolor Emboss Resist. I took a little longer than normal because it's got a few more steps, and embossing always takes a little bit of time, especially when you got a large surface to emboss. But I hope you learned something. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, give us a thumbs up. I'd love to hear your comments on what you think, and share the video with your friends so you can help us to grow our channels. And I thank you for watching. Have a great weekend, and Kathy will see you next week with something new and fun, I'm sure. See you then. Bye-bye.